Thank you, Secretary Yellen. Secretary Yellen, again, has been very flexible in scheduling this. We moved the hearing to 9 o'clock because she wanted as much time as possible. She has to leave by 11:30 exactly. I will enforce the 5-minute rule on myself and on everyone else. Last March, you and the banking regulators, after a banking crisis, had to step in and stabilize the system. It's a pattern we see all too often. Executives take outside risk to enrich themselves and rarely suffer consequences. 14 years ago, Congress gave FSOC important authorities to impose safeguards of the biggest, riskiest non-bank financial firms. Secretary Yellen, why are FSOC's designation authorities important for ensuring that Wall Street is accountable when it puts our financial system at risk?
Thank you for that question. I think if we look back to the financial crisis in 2008 and recognize that in some investment banks like Lehman Brothers that were not banks at all, but rather shadow banks or non-bank financial institutions, had very little capital and were immensely highly leveraged. And their failure touched off a financial crisis, the likes of which we hadn't seen since the Great Depression. As you mentioned in your opening comments, the toll that this took on American workers and businesses was utterly enormous. The unemployment rate rose close to double digits, and it took almost a decade to recover from that. And so making sure we, of course, focus on the banking sector, but there are non-banks that can pose risks to their material distress or their failure can pose tremendous spillovers and risks to the entire financial system. And when the council identifies such a firm, designation may be the appropriate way to handle that. And Dodd-Frank created an ability for FSOC to designate such firms for supervision by the Federal Reserve, and they need to have higher risk management, capital liquidity standards.
Thank you. And we again assert that FSOC should follow through in its non-bank designation guidelines and make sure there's appropriate oversight of these companies. We know that terrorist groups like Hamas, Al-Qaeda, and Hezbollah have used digital assets to raise and transfer funds. We have important tools to counter illicit finance, but most of them date back to the post-9/11 era. As terrorists continue to innovate, do we need to update our counterterrorism tools, Madam Secretary, to respond to the risks created by digital assets?
We do have authorities, many authorities, that enable us to act, but we've identified a number of holes in our authorities and have composed a list of suggestions for ways in which Treasury's authorities could and should be strengthened, and we look forward to working with you to try to accomplish that.
We will work with you on that. Some of it you can do as the Secretary of the Treasury. Much of it needs congressional authority. We will absolutely work with you. You've been cooperative all along. We will continue. My last question. It seemed like almost overnight last March, we learned the actions of a few executives, bank executives, put the whole system under stress. Thankfully, the system stabilized. But I think as a lesson is that risk to our banks can build up and suddenly emerge without much warning. It's what happened last year. When our banking system faces unexpected stresses, explain to us how strong capital rules reduce systemic risk and help to protect depositors and small businesses.
Well, capital is available to absorb losses from unanticipated shocks. What happened last March is that a couple of banking organizations that had really mismanaged their interest rate risk, which is a classic risk, something in a rising interest rate environment can lead to either realized or unrealized losses for banks. Strong capital enables these banks to remain viable, not to fail. And unfortunately, Silicon Valley Bank touched off it had enormous uninsured deposits, inadequate liquidity, and when it suffered these losses, it suffered a run. And that run threatened similar runs at other institutions that also had exposure to uninsured deposits. So the president, the Treasury, and the regulators took actions to try to stem a systemic bank run. And I believe we were successful in accomplishing that.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Senator Rounds of South Dakota is recognized.